Hi class, in this presentation we're going to continue our discussion of skeletal muscle organization, and we're going to dive in and focus on muscle compartments. Our muscles can be within a given muscle, we can have different groupings, and these groupings are going to be called compartments. And as we look at these compartments, all the muscles within a compartment are going to have the same overall function. So there's going to be a similar purpose. So as we look at the lower leg, or the distal portion of our leg, muscles that are on the anterior are going to be used primarily to help us dorsiflex the foot. Muscles that are on the posterior are going to be used primarily to help us plantar flex the foot. So we can take different muscles that are going to be in a similar location and serve a similar purpose and group them all together. Within these compartments, we're also going to have, and let me shift colors back to green here, blood vessels and nerves that supply those major groups. And it's worth emphasizing that these compartments are enclosed or encapsulated by fascia or connective tissue. Every once in a while, you'll hear of somebody having compartment syndrome. And when somebody has compartment syndrome, a lot of times what ends up happening is there's going to be some damage to the blood vessels within the compartment that is going to cause some hemorrhaging or bleeding. And then blood will build up within the compartment, and that causes the compartment to swell, have more pressure, and as pressure increases within the compartment, the blood vessels in the compartment are pinched off by the pressure from the hemorrhaging in the compartment. And then ultimately we have nerve damage, muscle tissue damage, and potentially death. This is kind of morbid, but one of the best ways to treat compartment syndrome is to slice the fascia, make an incision, usually a longitudinal incision or lengthwise incision, along the fascia of the compartment to relieve the pressure associated with the excessive buildup of blood. Something like that, though, gives me the EBGBs. Oh, I'm glad I've never had to experience that. Within these compartments, there are extra thick layers of connective tissue or extra thick layers of septa, referred to as intermuscular septa. And those intermuscular septa, if we look at the name, the root word inter means in between. In between what? Muscles. Septa is a generic term that refers to a barrier. Think of septums within our bodies. So these are barriers in between muscles that are going to separate one compartment from an adjacent compartment. Now, I had mentioned previously, but I'll mention it again, tendons are going to connect muscles to bone. And at this point, I hope it's tacit or common knowledge for you. Tendons are going to connect muscles to bone. And that's probably the single most common or the single most well-discussed way of attaching a muscle to bone. This is a indirect attachment. Another way that we can attach a muscle to a bone is, or a muscle to a bone, is through an aponeurosis. Think of an aponeurosis as a broad sheet of connective tissue. We have an aponeurosis that goes over the top of our skull, the superior margin of our skull connecting the frontalis muscle to the occipitalis muscle. We also have an aponeurosis present in our palm and also present on the superficial portion of the abdomen, superficial to the rectus abdominis. Let me go forward a couple. Oh, I misspoke there. We'll stay on this slide for now. So another way we can have an indirect attachment is with the retinaculum. And this retinaculum is a band of connective tissues that is going to be made of tendons. It helps to keep the tendons from one muscle grouped or separated from another group of tendons. Probably the single most common place that we look at, focus on this retinaculum, is going to be in the carpal and the wrist region. When somebody has carpal tunnel syndrome, a lot of times to treat that carpal tunnel syndrome, the retinaculum of that region of the body will be sliced to relieve the pressure that's building up on the tendons. Muscles can also directly attach to the bones or have fleshy attachment to the bones. And in these situations, it almost looks like the muscles coming directly out of the bone. More precisely, there are going to be small collagenous fibers from the endomysium and the perimysiums of those muscles that will then merge with the periosteum of the bone directly. Now, as we talk about muscle attachment points, the terms are origin insertion, Those are the old school terms. Origin typically refers to the part of the muscle that is stationary when it's contracted, and insertion typically refers to the part of the muscle which is moving when the muscle is contraction. However, there's a lot of exceptions to this rule. Some anatomists, and candidly, a lot of physical therapists that I know, my wife being one of them, oftentimes will refer to the proximal attachment versus the distal attachment, or the superior versus the inferior attachment. It's a little bit wordier, it has fewer exceptions to it. For me in particular, when I think of origin, I like to think of closer to the heart. And when I think of insertion, I like to think of the side of the muscle that is farther away from the heart. So that way I don't need to get mixed up with proximal versus distal when I'm working with an appendage, or superior and inferior when working with the head and the trunk. Some of these muscles, though, don't attach on bone. Instead of going to attach to a fascia or another broad sheath of muscle, like an aponeurosis or a reticulum. And these muscles oftentimes aren't going to have a standard origin and insertion associated with them. A good example of this is going to be the muscles of our face, our facial muscles, that are going to attach directly to the dermis of our skin, so that when we contract our facial muscles, we can have so many different facial expressions. Let's talk about how to categorize muscles as an intrinsic versus extrinsic. Intrinsic, as the name implies, is going to be entirely contained within. So intrinsic, think in, is going to be within a region. So intrinsic muscles are all going to be in one small part of the body. For example, the flexor digitorum brevis, it's a relatively small muscle that's going to be associated with flexing the digits. And hey, the muscle is short, it's brief in its length. Other muscles, such as extrinsic muscles, are going to be stored in one part of our body, but cause a separate part of our body to move. For example, if we look at our fingers, we have some extrinsic muscles on the forearm that are going to cause our fingers to contract or to relax, or excuse me, contract or extend. Another good example of an extrinsic muscle that's with the main body in one area and an attachment point somewhere else is going to be the gastrocnemius. It's going to be primarily housed within the calf of our body, but it's going to cause the foot of our body to move, to plantar flex. As we're looking at these muscles, we can also group them based on the kind of movement or the action that they have in our bodies. And these actions that we're going to talk about are prime movers, synergists, antagonists, and fixators. As we think of the prime movers, I want you to think of the big muscles, the muscles that bodybuilders typically are going to focus on, or the muscles that you really want to give some extra attention to when you're going to the weight room to bulk up and beef up so that you can have more net force being generated. So these are going to be the muscles that are the primary movers. And then we're going to have synergists. And then when we think of our synergists, I oftentimes like to think of these as the stabilizers, or the secondary muscle groups for those of you who spend a lot of time with athletic training. The prime movers are the big ones. So for example, we can have the biceps brachii as a prime mover, and then we can have the brachialis as a synergist. It helps the biceps brachii with flexion of the elbow, and it also helps to stabilize the elbow. We also can have antagonists, and these antagonists are going to oppose the prime mover. So really, when we're looking at an antagonist versus a prime mover or an agonist, it's all about defining your frame of reference. If my frame of reference is contracting the elbow, or flexion of the elbow, I should say, then the prime mover is going to be the biceps brachii. If my frame of reference is extension of the elbow joint, then my prime mover is going to be the triceps brachii. And because the biceps brachii and the triceps brachii are opposite to each other, if one is the point, if our frame of reference calls one the prime mover, the other one by default has to be the antagonist. And as we look at the prime mover antagonist, we can group them together as antagonistic pairs. There are several schools of thought right now in athletic training and personal training that like to emphasize supersets in the weight room or working with antagonistic pairs. For example, the person working out in the gym would do dumbbell curls to work out the biceps brachii, and then while they're resting the biceps brachii, they would go over to a bench and do bench press to work out the triceps brachii. And while the triceps brachii is working out, this biceps brachii is recovering, and they can alternate back and forth between the antagonistic pair, so that way they can get more sets in a shorter period of time. As we look at fixators, I want you to think of a fixator as a muscle that prevents movement of the bone. So these fixator muscles are going to be muscles that are traditionally associated with only stabilizing our joints, as opposed to causing major movements across the joints. Let's talk about how we can send electrical signals to our muscles. When you see this term innervation or innervate, that's going to refer to an electrical signal conducted by a nerve. So to innervate a muscle is to have a nerve, a specific nerve, send a electrical signal to that muscle. So if we know the nerve of the if we know what nerve stimulates a muscle, we know the innervation of that muscle. And if you can figure out which muscles in the body aren't working, you can potentially diagnose where in the brainstem a patient had a stroke, or where in the higher brain, within the cerebrum, or potentially the spinal cord, that patient had an injury to their central nervous system. Coming off the spinal cord, we have spinal nerves. There's going to be a pair of spinal nerves for every vertebrae in the vertebral column. And they're going to emerge through those intervertebral foramina, those little tiny holes in between the vertebrae. And they are immediately going to branch to rami that are anterior and posterior. And they're typically going to innervate any muscle below the neck. Above the neck, instead of spinal nerves, we're going to have cranial nerves innervating the muscles. So this is one of the reasons why somebody can break their neck, maybe C5 or C4, break their spine or their lower neck, and still have lots of cranial nerves in control of their face. But below that, they aren't going to have good control because they aren't going to be able to send signals to all of the downstream spinal nerves. As these spinal nerves are exiting the spinal cord, they're going to crisscross and form a web known as a plexus, and these plexi, or the plexus, is going to be directly adjacent to the vertebral column. There's a cervical, a brachial, a lumbar, and sacral plexus that we're going to ask you to focus on with your lab objectives. As we look at those cranial nerves that are going to focus on the nerves of the cervical vertebrae, we have 12 total, and they're numbered using Roman numerals. So we have CI for cranial nerve 1, all the way to CNXII for cranial nerve 12. And we'll talk about these in more detail in our nervous system, our final unit in this class. Briefly, though, we go, as we're numbering our cranial nerves, we'll start at the anterior or rostral end of the brain, and we'll work our way posterior or towards the caudal end of the brain to number our cranial nerves from 1 to 12. Our muscular system is also going to need a lot of blood to supply a lot of nutrients so it can have lots of energy. So we're going to send about 1.2 or 1.25 liters of blood per minute to our skeletal muscles when we're at rest. So by default, we're going to be sending a good chunk of our heart's cardiac output to all the skeletal muscles of our body. But when we're exercising really heavily, that amount of blood can be increased very dramatically. So instead of having about a quarter of our cardiac output going to the skeletal muscles, we can have about 3/4 of our cardiac output going to the skeletal muscles. As that blood is going to the skeletal muscle tissues, we're going to go from an artery to an arterial to little tiny blood vessels called capillaries that are then going to branch through the endomysium of the skeletal muscle so that every individual skeletal muscle fiber, also known as skeletal muscle cell, can receive nutrients along the entire length of the skeletal muscle cell. As we name our muscles, they are going to be named different ways. We can have Latin roots or descriptive roots. So if we think of depressor labii inferioris, this is all going to be focusing on the Latin names. Particular, the depressor labii inferioris is on the inferior margin of the lip and causes us to depress the lips. Or we can have the flexor digiti minimi brevis. This is a muscle that's going to flex the digits, and it's short and tiny. Or we can have a name that is going to help us to find the location of the muscle. For example, the tibialis anterior is going to be on the anterior side of the tibial bone. Or, my personal favorite, the sternocleidomastoid is going to have an attachment point of the mastoid process on the temporal bone, go across the clavicle, cluteo for clavicle, and finally attach to the sternum. And that's all we have for this recording. If you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email, post it on the discussion boards, and as always, happy studies.